It was the kind of place people drove past without thinking twice, a quiet stretch of old houses tucked behind iron gates and hedges that were trimmed so neatly they looked like they'd been drawn with a ruler. The air smelled faintly of salt from the nearby coast, and when the wind passed through the narrow streets, it carried the sound of distant waves and the occasional thump of a gate swinging shut. In the evenings, the lamps along the road glowed a soft gold, casting long shadows over the cobblestones. It was the kind of neighborhood where bad things weren't supposed to happen, but bad things had a way of hiding behind beautiful walls. At the edge of the cul-de-sac stood the Harrington house, a sprawling, pale stone property with tall windows that always seemed to reflect the sky in an almost perfect way. It was a house that looked more like a statement than a home, the kind people stared at from their car windows and thought, whoever lives there must have everything. And for a while it seemed like that was true. On paper, the couple inside had the kind of life other people might envy. But inside, the air was heavier than it should have been. Conversations didn't linger in that house. They ended too quickly or too sharply. Smiles never seemed to reach the eyes. Before it became a crime scene, it was a home where dinner was served at the same time every night, where the sound of expensive wine being poured was as much a part of the routine as the clink of silverware on porcelain plates. Neighbors only saw the polished side of their lives. He was the kind of man who knew exactly how to charm an audience, whether it was 2 people or 200. Tall, well-kept, with a voice that carried in a way that made people lean in without realizing it. He'd built his fortune over decades, and with it came the quiet arrogance of someone who had always been in control. She was younger, beautiful in a way that didn't need dressing up, but always dressed up anyway, the kind of beauty that drew attention and the kind of presence that kept it. People whispered about the age difference, of course. Some even whispered about her reasons for marrying him. But in public, they were seamless, her hand resting lightly on his arm, his eyes following her in a way that looked protective, but might have been something else entirely. The first signs of trouble were invisible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. A missed party here, a long trip taken alone there. The way her smile sometimes faltered a second too early, the way his voice shifted when speaking to her, dropping the warmth he showed to others. They lived in a house full of expensive things, but seemed to tiptoe around each other like strangers sharing the same hotel room. She'd grown up far from wealth, where bills were paid late, and arguments about money bled into arguments about everything else. The life she married into was the opposite of that. Quiet, orderly, with every possible need taken care of. But the price for that comfort was harder to see at first. He liked things his way, always. What they did, who they saw, even the way she dressed. It was all part of a structure he'd built long before she arrived. There was a kind of tension in the Harrington house that never broke into open fighting, but never fully disappeared either. It was in the way he'd correct her in front of others without realizing it, or the way she'd hesitate before answering his questions, as if trying to read what the right answer should be. To anyone else, they looked picture perfect. Inside, there were cracks. Small, silent ones, but cracks all the same. If you'd been standing outside that night before the sirens came, you wouldn't have noticed anything strange. The curtains were drawn, the lights glowed warmly from inside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the street lamps hummed faintly. It was calm, ordinary. The last ordinary night before everything that had been hidden in that house finally came to the surface. The will had been sitting quietly in a desk drawer upstairs for years, waiting for the day someone would find it. And when she finally did, it would be the moment that turned their carefully constructed life into something else entirely. Something dangerous. Something that would end with the front gate left swinging in the wind, the house silent except for the sound of footsteps moving through it for the last time. It started small, as these things often do, so small it could have been brushed off as nothing. A sharp remark at dinner, a phone call that ended too quickly when she walked into the room, a question about where she'd been that sounded casual but wasn't. The Harringtons had always been skilled at keeping their disagreements out of sight, but over time, the cracks in their façade widened. He began watching her more closely, like a man who'd suddenly realized something valuable might slip from his grasp. She, in turn, grew careful, not in a way that suggested guilt, but in a way that suggested she was tired of being cornered. The turning point came one autumn night at a charity event. She'd worn a deep green dress that caught the light in a way that made people's heads turn. A younger man, a business associate's son, spent a little too long speaking to her, leaning in, laughing at something she said. She laughed back, lightly. But when she turned, she found her husband's eyes locked on her with a look that was colder than any winter wind. He didn't say a word until they were in the car. Hedy, Nang home, and even then, it was only a single sentence. "You're forgetting who you are." She didn't answer. She just stared out the window, her reflection trembling in the glass as the streetlights slid past. From that night on, the air in the house thickened. He began calling her more during the day, asking where she was, who she was with. She told herself it was harmless, that he was just being protective. But his questions became sharper, his tone quieter, more dangerous. Once, she caught him going through her handbag. Another time, she noticed the faint smell of cigarette smoke in her car, even though she didn't smoke. She realized he'd been sitting in it while she was out, waiting, watching. But it wasn't just jealousy. There was something else brewing, something tied to money, to the quiet hum of financial matters she'd never been allowed to see. He'd always handled their accounts, their investments, everything. She was given a monthly allowance, generous enough to keep her from asking questions. But one afternoon, she overheard a phone call. His voice low and sharp, speaking to someone about liquidating assets and covering losses. He ended the call quickly when he saw her, smiling like nothing had happened. That same week, a thick envelope arrived in the mail addressed to him, stamped with the logo of a law firm she didn't recognize. He placed it in his briefcase without opening it in front of her. She might have forgotten about it, if not for the way his mood soured over the next few days, like a man carrying a weight he couldn't set down. The past began seeping into the present in strange ways. An old friend of his visited one evening, a man with the kind of tight smile that hid more than it revealed. They drank too much whiskey, and the friend let slip a few comments about the good old days, hinting at deals that hadn't exactly been clean. She sat there, silent, wondering how much of what she thought she knew about her husband was true. Meanwhile, her past was catching up with her. She'd left behind more than just a small-town life when she married him. There were people she hadn't spoken to in years, debts that had been quietly settled by someone else. She'd thought those pieces of her history had been buried for good, but one day, she received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end belonged to a man she hadn't heard from in nearly a decade, and he wasn't calling to catch up. He needed money, and he knew exactly how to get it from her. By reminding her of what she'd done before she ever set foot in the Harrington house. She didn't tell her husband about the call. She couldn't. But she started pulling small amounts of cash from the household account when she thought he wouldn't notice. Each time she told herself it would be the last. Each time the man called again. As the weeks wore on, the distance between them turned into a strange sort of closeness. Not the warm kind, but the oppressive kind. Like being trapped in a small room with no air. He began making unannounced appearances wherever she went, showing up at the boutique where she shopped, the cafe where she met friends. When she protested, he said he just wanted to spend more time together. His words were soft, but his eyes were hard. One night over dinner, he mentioned casually that he'd updated his will. She froze, fork halfway to her mouth. "Just making sure everything's in order," he said, pouring himself more wine. "In case something happens." There was nothing strange in his tone, but something about the way he said it made her skin crawl. She didn't ask what changes he'd made. She didn't want to know. Her sleep grew restless. She began waking in the middle of the night, listening for sounds in the house. Once, she thought she heard the faint click of the study door closing at 2 in the morning. Another time she woke to find him standing at the bedroom window, staring out into the darkness, his face pale in the moonlight. He didn't speak when she asked what he was looking at, just turned and got back into bed, his back to her. Outside pressures were mounting for him too. The economy was shifting, certain investments weren't performing, and a legal dispute over a piece of property dragged on longer than expected. He hated losing control over anything, and now it felt like parts of his life were slipping away. Control was something he'd built his entire identity on, and when control starts to slip, people like him don't always react well. Every interaction between them began to carry an unspoken threat. He never said anything outright, but she could feel it. The weight of words left unsaid, the tension in his jaw, the way his hand sometimes tightened around his glass until his knuckles went white. She found herself thinking about escape in abstract ways, what it would feel like to breathe freely again, to walk into a room without bracing for the conversation. But she didn't leave. Not yet. And then came the night she found the will. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd gone into his study to leave a book on his desk, but the drawer was slightly open. Inside was a stack of papers, and on top, in neat black ink, was her name. She read just enough to understand that her future had been rewritten without her knowledge, and that if something happened to him, she wouldn't inherit what she thought. She'd be left with almost nothing. When he came home that evening, she didn't mention what she'd found, but something in her had shifted. She looked at him differently now, and he noticed. And once he noticed, everything began to move faster, like a train picking up speed before a curve it can't quite make. The night it happened, the air felt different, thick, unmoving, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Rain tapped against the windows in slow, uneven beats, and the wind rattled the trees outside just enough to make them whisper. She'd been in the kitchen, moving through the quiet, when she heard the sound of the study door close upstairs. It was almost midnight. He never used the study this late, unless something was wrong. She climbed the stairs slowly, the carpet muffling her steps, her heart keeping time in her chest. The study door was ajar, a faint light spilling into the hallway. He was inside, standing over his desk, flipping through a folder. He didn't look up when she entered. She saw the will lie there again. Open this time. Her name printed in sharp black letters. Her stomach tightened. "What is this?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He looked at her finally, his expression unreadable. "It's exactly what it looks like," he said. His tone was calm, almost too calm. "I've made changes. For everyone's good." "For your good," she said, the words sharper than she intended. His jaw tightened. "Careful." Something in her broke then. Weeks, months, maybe years of being watched, controlled, second-guessed. She stepped closer, the rain behind her pounding harder now, as if it was urging the moment forward. "You think you can just—" He slammed the folder shut. The sound made her flinch. "I've given you everything," he said, his voice rising for the first time in weeks. "Everything you are now is because of me. And you repay me by sneaking around, by making me look like a fool." Her pulse was a drumbeat in her ears. "You made me a prisoner." That was the breaking point. He moved toward her quickly, closing the distance in 2 steps. She backed away until her hip hit the edge of the desk. His hands came down hard on the wood, trapping her. His breath was hot, sharp with whiskey. "You don't get to walk away from me," he said. Something cold and focused slid into her mind then, a strange clarity. She reached behind her, her fingers brushing the heavy brass letter opener on the desk. It was weighty, solid, pointed. He was still talking, leaning in, his voice a low, dangerous growl. She didn't remember deciding. She just remembered the feeling of her arm moving, the resistance, the sudden wet heat. For a second, everything went silent. His eyes widened, not in rage this time, but in shock. His hand went to his chest, where the dark stain was already spreading. He staggered back, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. The sound came rushing back all at once, the rain, her ragged breathing, the dull thud of his body hitting the floor. She stood there frozen, the letter opener still in her hand, slick now, the metallic scent of blood curling into the air. She knelt beside him, her hands shaking so badly she could barely touch him. His eyes were still open, glassy now, his breath shallow and fading. "I didn't," she began, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't tell if she was trying to convince him or herself. When his chest stopped moving, the silence inside the room became unbearable. She dropped the letter opener on the carpet and stumbled back, pressing a hand to her mouth. Her mind raced, not with grief, not yet, but with the mechanical, panicked thoughts of what came next. She thought of calling for help. She thought of running. But instead, she shut the study door. She moved through the house like a ghost, pulling on gloves from the kitchen drawer, wiping the brass handle clean. She poured herself a glass of water but couldn't drink it. Every sound in the house seemed amplified now. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the rain against the windows. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears. Upstairs, his body lay exactly where it had fallen. She didn't look again. She couldn't. But the smell of iron seemed to follow her, seeping into her skin. By the time the first light of morning began to push through the curtains, she was sitting on the couch in the dark, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she'd been waiting for something. The house was so quiet, it felt like it was holding on to a secret, one she wasn't sure she could keep. Morning light didn't soften anything. It only made it real. The pale sun slid across the living room, touching the untouched coffee cup on the table, the coat she'd never hung up, the faint smear of something dark at the edge of her sleeve. She'd changed her clothes hours ago, folding the stained ones neatly into a garbage bag she hadn't yet decided what to do with. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock, and with every second, the space between what she'd done and what she was about to do stretched wider. At first she told herself she'd call the police and explain that it had been self-defense, that he'd cornered her, and she'd panicked. But the longer she sat there, the more she thought about the will, about how it would look when they found it, about the whispers that would start long before the truth could be told, if there even was a truth they'd believe. She thought of the neighbours, the charity committees, the old friends who would nod knowingly and say, "She married him for the money, and look how it ended." When she finally moved, it wasn't to call anyone. She went upstairs, avoiding the study door, and pulled a suitcase from the closet. Her movements were mechanical, packing the essentials, tucking her passport between shirts, slipping the small stack of cash she'd been hiding into the side pocket. Every step was deliberate, quiet, as though she might wake him, even though she knew she never would again. But leaving wasn't as simple as walking out the front door. The gate at the end of the drive was monitored. His business associates would notice if he went missing. She knew the police would be at her door eventually, whether she stayed or ran. That knowledge sat like a stone in her stomach, making every breath heavy. The news broke 2 days later. By then she was already gone. They found him in the study. The cause of death ruled as suspicious, before the autopsy confirmed what the blood on the carpet had already told them. The community reacted with shock, but it was the polished kind, the type where people shake their heads in disbelief while secretly feeding on the drama. His face was everywhere, on the evening news, in print, framed by headlines that called him beloved and successful. There were no headlines about the man who had controlled every inch of his wife's life, no quotes about the cracks beneath the perfect image. for the people who had known them casually, neighbors, acquaintances. The news was like an earthquake that shook a house they thought was built on stone. They remembered the Harringtons at galas, arm in arm, smiling like nothing could touch them. Now, every old conversation was re-examined for signs they'd missed. Some swore they'd always sensed something wrong. Others insisted it was impossible. They seemed so happy. For those who had known them more closely, the grief was tangled. His relatives clung to the image of the man they'd known, refusing to believe anything darker existed. Her absence became proof of guilt in their eyes. Old friends of hers were split, some reaching out in quiet messages of support, others cutting ties entirely, afraid of being dragged into whatever storm was brewing. She kept moving. Cheap motels, cash payments, different names. In the quiet of those dim rooms, guilt didn't come all at once. It seeped in slowly, in the stillness before sleep, in the flicker of a television she wasn't watching. Sometimes she felt a strange, raw relief, like she could finally breathe. Other times, she woke gasping, convinced she'd hear his footsteps coming down the hall. The investigation built momentum. Detectives pieced together timelines, examined phone records, and dug into financial documents. The will became a centerpiece of their theory. The media painted her as a calculated predator, cold, manipulative, the kind of woman who married for money and killed when the terms changed. The story was too neat, too dramatic for anyone to question much. The irony was that she'd never wanted the money, not in the way they thought. She'd wanted freedom, stability, a life without the weight of the past constantly pressing in. But somewhere along the way, that safety had become another kind of prison. The night in the study had been less about greed and more about survival, but that was a truth she couldn't tell, not without everything she'd done since becoming its crime. By the end of the first month, her face was everywhere. CCTV footage from a bus station, a grainy photo from a gas station camera. She saw herself on a news report once, in the corner of a motel lobby, and had to leave immediately, heart pounding. The world was closing in, but she kept moving, because stopping meant facing it all. Back in the neighborhood, the Harrington house stayed dark. The lawn went uncut, the mailbox overflowed, and the gate stayed shut. People slowed their cars to look, whispering about the woman who had lived there and the man who had died there. Some swore the place felt different now, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the violence. In the end, the truth didn't matter to most. What mattered was the story they could tell, the one where the beautiful young wife turned on the man who gave her everything. It was easier to believe that than to see the messier, smaller truths. Easier to turn the crime into a cautionary tale than to admit that behind many perfect doors, the air is heavy and the cracks are already forming. And somewhere, far from that cul-de-sac, she sat alone in another rented room, the suitcase still by the bed, the weight of both freedom and guilt pressing down on her. She knew it couldn't last. They would find her, one way or another. But for now, she was just breathing, each breath proof that, for better or worse, she was still here. They found her 6 months later in a small town 2 states away, living untethered, a name that wasn't hers. The arrest was quiet, no sirens, no shouting, just 2 plainclothes officers waiting outside a corner store as she stepped out with a paper bag of groceries. She didn't resist. She didn't say a word. By the time they placed her in the back of the car, she knew this was the end of the road she'd been walking since the night in the study. The trial was everything the media wanted it to be. Sensational, dripping with the kind of drama that drew cameras like moths to a flame. They replayed her life in fragments, the photographs from charity events, the smiling vacation pictures, the grainy security footage from her months on the run. The prosecution painted her as a cold, calculated killer who saw the will and decided she wouldn't lose what she believed she was owed. The defense fought to tell a different story, that of a woman trapped in a controlling marriage who acted out of fear, not greed. The truth lived somewhere between those narratives, but trials aren't built for the whole truth. They're built for the story that wins. When the verdict came, the courtroom was still. Guilty, second-degree murder. The sentence, 20 years. She didn't cry. She just stared ahead, her face unreadable. Some said it was proof of her coldness. Others thought it was the only way she could keep from breaking entirely. In the months that followed, the world moved on. His family worked to preserve his reputation, holding memorial events that spoke only of his achievements, never of the man behind closed doors. Her name became a shorthand for betrayal in tabloid headlines, another addition to the long list of Black Widow stories people devoured, without thinking about the weight of the lives inside them. Inside the prison, she lived quietly. She kept to herself, read more than she ever had, and worked in the library. Some of the other women asked her about the case, wanting to know if the things they'd heard were true. She usually just shook her head. The truth was too tangled to unravel in casual conversation. The house sat empty for years, eventually sold to a developer who stripped it down and rebuilt it into something new. But those who had lived in the neighborhood for decades swore it still felt the same, like a beautiful shell that had once hidden something poisonous. The case left marks beyond the people directly involved. It became a talking point about spousal control, financial secrecy in marriages, and how easily an image can hide the slow corrosion of a relationship. Some saw it as proof that wealth can't buy happiness. Others used it to argue for stricter laws on spousal inheritance and the handling of wills. But beneath the legal debates and moral posturing, there was a quieter truth that didn't fit neatly into newspaper columns. 2 lives had been destroyed long before the crime ever happened. The night in the study wasn't the beginning. It was the final violent expression of years of unspoken resentment, fear, and need. Was justice served? The law said yes. She was behind bars, the punishment handed down, but justice is more complicated than a verdict. It doesn't account for the way control can suffocate someone without ever leaving a mark. It doesn't weigh the years of quiet fear against a single moment of violence. And it doesn't erase the fact that 2 people walked into a marriage expecting safety and found something far more dangerous. In the end, the story was less about money and more about power, how it's given, how it's taken, and how it's used to bind someone in ways they can't always see until it's too late. It was about the roles people play in public and the truths they hide in private. About how quickly love can turn into something unrecognizable when control becomes more important than connection. She once told her cellmate, in one of the few moments she spoke openly, that the worst part wasn't the prison or the trial. It was knowing that even if she could go back, she didn't know how to rewrite the story without it ending in some kind of loss. Maybe not this loss, maybe not this crime, but something broken all the same. And that might be the most unsettling truth of all. Sometimes there's no clean line between victim and perpetrator, no neat moral lesson to take away. Just 2 lives, colliding in ways neither could undo, leaving behind a story that people will tell over and over, never quite the same way twice,